Welcome to Nasdaq TradeTalks. I'm your host, Jill Malandrino, global markets reporter at Nasdaq. We're coming to you live from the Nasdaq market site in Times Square, New York City for our climate tech coverage in September. And joining us for this segment, we have David Mullings, Chairman and CEO of Mahoe Capital, as well as Jason Dodier, co-founder and COO of GRAIN Ecosystem. We're here to discuss the crucial role of public-private partnerships to ensure that climate initiatives are both economically viable and environmentally stable. It is great to have the both of you with us. Welcome to Trade Talks. And quickly, David, let's get a brief introduction into Mahoe Capital.
Well, thank you for having me once again.
Got it.
Our focus is really trying to build the Berkshire Hathaway of the Caribbean. We want to unlock capital to flow into that region that has been traditionally overlooked. And we intend to list on Nasdaq and provide a public vehicle that's trusted, liquid, transparent, and giving people access.
Yeah, we'll have to do the IPO ceremony down in the islands.
Can't wait.
Especially if it's over the winter here in New York. So let's talk a little bit more about GRAIN. Tell us more.
Yeah, so GRAIN Ecosystem really came out of Schneider Electric. It was a global incubation challenge, and we saw a real problem in circular economy. How to take waste, turn it into value. A lot of us had spent a lot of time doing decarbonization, microgrid projects. GRAIN is at the nexus of helping project developers that have waste turn that into economic value and hopefully sequester a lot of carbon in the process.
Right, and as we know with climate technology, it is capital intensive, it is time intensive, it is regulatory intensive. Jason, tell us about the importance of public-private partnerships to execute on these very big ideas.
I was very fortunate. What brought me to New York City originally, so I spent a lot of my career internationally, Middle East, I lived in Europe. I came to New York City originally to help lead the microgrid work for the JFK Terminal 1 public-private partnership. At the time, it was one of the largest in the country. Oh. And you really see the importance of bringing capital allocators together. At that time, Carlyle was leading the effort, and technology providers, companies like Schneider Electric, to really think through complex problems. Because when you look at the country and you think about 30% of our distribution and 60% of transmission lines being potentially end of life, this is mission critical. So how do you align capital and technology together? And that's very much, and with the policy work, and that's very much at the root of what GRAIN's doing as well when you think about how to have an impact for farmers. So without it, it's very tough.
But David, that's what lends to the complications and complexities that you face with public-private partnerships. Let's use an electric grid as an example. You just don't flip a switch or plug a cord in a wall. It could take 10 to 12 years to put a new grid online.
It takes a lot of time. You see the devastation we've had in the Caribbean just this past summer. We had another intense hurricane that hit a number of islands, and thankfully most of Jamaica was spared. But for example, the southeast part of Jamaica, which is a breadbasket, was without power for 20 plus days because the power lines went down. And this is where the farmers are. So your food is going to spoil. It costs a lot of money to replace that. So when you talk about microgrids, these are the kinds of technologies that we need to bring to places like the Caribbean. You know, small island developing states are especially vulnerable. They typically have one power supplier. Look at a country like Jamaica. I mean, losing probably 25% of the power just in transmission is inefficient. Right. And that needs to be upgraded.
So, okay, when I think about the islands, the two power sources are wind and sun. The Caribbean has a lot of that, right?
A lot.
Why are these upgrades not being made to, you know, the breadbasket of Jamaica as an example? Because when you're down for 20, 25 days, that impacts the entire economy because businesses can't operate.
Well, so we have to clarify. There is solar across the Caribbean. There's wind. Jamaica, in fact, actually has a publicly traded vehicle that does the wind farm. The government actually put it public. So that's not the issue. You still have to transmit the power somewhere, and it has to usually go over lines. But the second thing is you think about a factory, for example. The factory can't just run on solar or wind. That's intermittent power. So we mostly use natural gas or coal. Well, no more coal. We move from that. We burn in bunker C diesel, which is bad. So we think actually there's opportunity in SMRs, nuclear small modular reactors. You think of what's inside a small nuclear submarine. There's an opportunity. We think there's technology that's not here for the next 10 to 15 years, but there's an opportunity there to bring that to the region and provide base load power. Solar and wind are great, but that's not base load power.
Right. So when we think about engagement and communication strategies, when you're going to different types of stakeholders, capital intensive, the investment's going to be locked up for quite some time, and then it needs to be executed upon with the appropriate skill set. How are you convincing PE, private capital, public asset managers to invest in climate tech?
So first of all, just on your note on coal, there are in the US 10 times more employees at Starbucks than there are in the coal industry. So we are seeing some decarbonization. It's a statistic I saw recently. I thought it was fantastic on commitment. So it's really, I always say it has to be a lot more than shareholder values. You have to have shared commitment. And a lot of these projects are locking in long-term economic incentives, whether that's through ESA, energy supply agreements. It's leases, it's tolls. You have to realize and understand the economic incentives and the tax money that could potentially come from these projects. And that's what I think we were really very effective at initially. And then it's also, there's a lot of money on the table. So it's how do you tap in, Jill, to those incentives that are there? So a lot of the work with grain today, it's USDA, reimbursing farmers and ensuring, to your point, you made an exceptional point, there's a tinderbox out there. There is a lot of woody biomass from trees and other things. When these transmission lines or distribution poles, et cetera, snap off, it ignites and it causes major forest fires. So you have to highlight the risk avoidance element of doing these projects, which is something that we really pride ourselves in. That's what we did at Terminal 1 in the very early days.
Yeah,
that's great.
And also, when you think about this, David, it's scalability that the private sector offers, right? And you also have to think about what can the public side of the equation do.
Right,
because you have to be able to convince public policymakers that
that is worth their time, right? Ultimately, they were elected by constituents, and their job is to deliver for those people. I think in the Caribbean, we have tended to think too focused, or tend to think too small in the sense of focus on each individual island versus, hey, this is a regional problem. In fact, it's a global problem, but we can do stuff together. Individual islands don't have enough money to tackle these things, but if they can come together as a group, which we have CARICOM already, so Bahamas, Barbados, all these countries are part of that, they could work together and say, hey, here's our project that's working here, but we can't get all the money. Can we partner with you and pull together a Caribbean financing facility, for example? So in our case, we are focused on raising capital from the Caribbean diaspora. They are very focused on investing back home, but there's a trust deficit. And so you talk about how do we get them to put capital to work? We use a vehicle here, but then do they know that the right people? How do we fix that problem? And how do we get to move faster? How do we move at boat speed? And now we're going to talk about St. Lucia and Alfred's speed. We want to move quickly, but we need to be moving smartly as well.
Yeah, we had a guest on the show yesterday. We were talking about this off camera, but I'm totally going to hijack this expression here. Versus, how fast are we moving with progress within the climate tech space? And his response was, we need to think about moving at the speed of trust, not necessarily, the velocity of speed in itself. And I thought that was such a fantastic way to express this, because when you're thinking about, you kind of have to set the right descriptions as well. ESG sometimes doesn't have the most positive connotation, so how is climate tech different than that? What's going to be done to advance society? How are we going to get returns on these investments? That's what people want to hear.
Yep. Yeah.
Trust, transparency. I mean, our goal is how do you make reversible decisions quick and irreversible decisions deliberate? And you do that with trust. One of the reasons we love circular economy and biochar and waste to value is there are processes with biochar to be able to figure out how do you maximize, how do you take a waste feedstock and maximize economic incentives from that, whether it's renewable natural gas, biochar for soil, wood vinegar, but also the transparency through measurement, reporting, and verification. 97% of the carbon market today, retirements, is from biochar. It's the quickest time to deliver, and that's the ethos of why we picked to start there. That's how you move fast. You have to go with trusted solutions that you can prove out transparency and credibility, because without that, you have really, really big problems and you move slow.
And that's a challenge that you're facing in the Caribbean because of the lack of trust between the islands and how that's perceived. So is progress being made there in terms of speed of trust? Because at the end of the day, these are good jobs. These are improving skill sets. You are reskilling the entire economic workforce. The better salaries that these workers have, guess what? That goes back into the economy.
Exactly. The multiplier effect of having better jobs is great. So yes, progress is being made across many regions. You think about a country like the Bahamas, for example. That's where our CIO, Kevin Burrs, is based. They went and did a debt swap and said, hey, we have this high debt, we want to bring it down, and then the difference that they're going to save between the original debt rate and the new rate goes into a fund, and they created a Bahamas Sustainability Fund. We look at Barbados with Prime Minister Mia Mottley, who's a leader among small island developing states about this. And she quoted Nelson Mandela last year when she was speaking at UN, and she was talking about vision with action, right? That can actually inspire people. The key thing is that we're not lacking vision in the Caribbean. We're lacking more action, and we need capital for action to actually move quicker.
So with Blue Mahoe listing, right, and you will, as a public company, you have to be able to provide that transparency and auditability. Do you think that can help bridge the trust gap?
So I would say I don't think, I know. I've spoken to enough people. We've done our roadshow. We've spoken to so many people. We have people coming to us all the time on social media because they've never had a vehicle that is listed, that is audited, that's transparent, that's regulated, that allows them to say, you know what, I'll buy shares in this thing, and I know he's investing back in the Caribbean. And I get in quarterly reports, the senior reporting we're doing. Here's the companies, here's the government entities we're working with. Here's the boards that we're interfacing with. They've never, ever had that. There is no listed vehicle outside the region. So I know for a fact it will make a difference. And the key thing, though, is to get people to learn about why we're doing it. It can't just be, hey, here's a return that we're getting. We're investing in this specific area. And I'll give you a simple example. Think about Barbados. A small island is how we think of it. It's the easternmost island in the Caribbean. You need to think of their economic area. So it's a small island. It really should be think of as a big ocean state. Their ocean that they have economic control over is the size of Florida. That's a massive opportunity. We need to find ways to invest and support that. And then there's blue bonds that have been issued on their part. You have green bonds coming to Guyana. So yes, it will make a massive difference to have transparency and liquidity. People need the liquidity as well.
Right, well, and hopefully that'll be the catalyst to get other companies in the Caribbean to list. Competition's always a good thing, right?
Always
it's only
a good
going to help to build the region.
Yes, exactly.
Right.
And on that note, David, debt nature swaps. So figuring out how do you forgive debt, and in return, that capital is being leveraged for restoration projects, resilience projects. You know, you think about companies like Swiss Re coming to the table to have insurance programs that get reenacted faster when you do have catastrophic events. Schneider Electric walking the talk with their access to energy program in the community. You know, courage is knowing what not to fear, and we shouldn't fear re-education. We shouldn't fear these jobs and looking at leveraging public-private coming together. We have to think intuitively and retrospectively, and also down the line. And a lot of this is the issue sometimes on the policy side. People are too short-minded. They're thinking in terms of legislative cycles. Yes. We need to back away from that and really look at the long-term vision. That's why I like 2030 plans. We look at 2050. We look at tipping points. But for me and for Grain and our team and our industry, we're really looking at how are we progressing as it relates to 2030 objectives and near-term objectives.
Are those objectives realistic? I mean, you're only, let's do the math here, 5.5 years out?
Well, I try to maintain a lot of optimism. I think it's really important to do that. What we are seeing from a project execution perspective is that we are getting there. There are places like the Nordics. If you look at what Sweden and Norway and Denmark have done to drive circular economy, it's pretty impressive. There is a lot of capital out there. There's a lot of capital in this country. And I think the biggest thing, going back to what you were saying, David, is the waste of that money, ensuring you're bringing in communities, you're bringing in minority, women-owned businesses, which, by the way, Terminal 1, I think, did better than most projects that I've been a part of and I've seen. So you've got to engage community. Stakeholder engagement is the most important thing. And the last thing I'll say is the way we get to 2030 faster, you need big corporates with massive value chains. So if you look at California, SB 251 and 263, visibility on emissions profiles across the value chain, how do you get everybody engaged to ensure that they're participating, they're sharing in the outcomes, and really it's about execution coming out of COP28.
I'm getting
execution.
I know.
Execution.
So, and that's
Loss and damage funds.
And this is hopefully videos and segments like this will be able to help influence that because again there is that connotation and everything kind of has become politicized when you think about climate. But I feel like in the terms that we're speaking of it, larger economy, right? Not trickle down effect, but the circular economy there and the jobs and the skill sets and the investment returns that this has the potential for.
It really has to come down to economic development. Right? People want to save the planet, but at the same time they need to feed their kids and they want to earn better returns on whatever they're going to deploy with their money from a business standpoint. So we need people to understand, for example, you look at in parts of the Caribbean where we have coral, right? We lost 60+% of the coral. This is heavily dependent on tourism. We need to change first the dependence on tourism so much, but secondly, hey, you're a fisherman, you need to stop killing the parrotfish because those are the fish that take care of the corals, and the corals are what allows us to have beach, and the corals also have the sanctuary for the fish. So you don't want to kill your own livelihood. So you talked about re-education earlier, Jason. That's exactly some of the things we have to do. They have to see the economic benefit of each of the investments that we would make.
Yeah, I mean, I'm looking at here some of the, that was more of your more popular issues that you had noted, less popular issues: waste management, climate resilient housing, energy infrastructure, freshwater access, food security. That sounds pretty important to me.
The freshwater one is so weird, right? We think, oh, you live in the islands, you live in the Caribbean. It's like, yes, you're surrounded by water. How do you have water problems? I said, you can't drink salt water. You have to drink fresh water. And if the beach is eroding or we're having rising sea levels, Guyana, for example, is a big issue. that water now brings salinity into your fresh water. So if you mix fresh water and salt water, I can't drink it. So you need desalination plants. You need to build infrastructure, bigger walls, sea walls. We need people to understand that it's not just about, the climate is getting hotter and the hurricanes are now stronger and more frequent. There's so much more. If we can't grow the foods we need to eat because we don't have fresh water, then we have to import foods. Well, where are we getting the US dollars to import those foods? Right? Bahamas imports 80+%.
Oh, that's why it's so expensive too.
Yeah. Which then pushes up the cost. When you look at Bahamas, they don't have the space to grow the land. They don't have the land space to grow the fruits and vegetables. But we could do indoor vertical farming. Might be an opportunity there. When you look at other parts of the Caribbean, Suriname, Guyana, Jamaica, and Belize that have a large amount of land, they could actually become the suppliers for more than just rice for the region. So food security is crucial, but it requires somebody like Jason going to us, soil health. We need healthy soil.
Yeah, and think about it. We do vertical farming in Brooklyn, New York. I mean, if we could do it there, you could certainly do it in a climate like the Caribbean.
Exactly.
And New York has been at the forefront of composting. I think I always go back to the statistics. If you look at in pre-industrial revolution and today, our soil had 10% carbon. Now it's less than 1% in many cases. I mean, it's the few that feeds the many. It used to be over 80% that were involved in agriculture in this country. Now it's probably less than 2%. So for us, it's always from an inference perspective, how are you taking those wastes, whether it's rice husks, corn, the biomass,
Please tell me you can use coconut
sugar production,
sugar protection,
coconut.
exactly.
I mean, there are so many ways to take it. And I could talk for days about the benefits of things like a biochar on microbial nature of soil, higher yields, greater water retention, so you need less water. And obviously at the end of it, you look at Iowa, I think it's the second state in this country from a cancer perspective. It's because you've got a lot of runoff, you've got nitrous oxide, you've got other harmful chemicals. So we're trying to solve all of this in parallel. And that's why partnering in the Caribbean, it's just a natural, we have a global lens. We don't want to just be focused here because we have to share best practices.
Yeah, and you would take in a state like Iowa, which doesn't have as much emissions like we do in New York or in LA, right? I mean, it's kind of a lot of open farmland there. That just helps to illustrate the point even more in terms of, from the ground up, how important this is.
And my two biggest fears today, number one, tragedy of the commons, people sitting on the sideline waiting for somebody else to do it, to put money in capital. And that's why I love the Carbon Dioxide Removal Leadership Act, sponsored by Congressman Tonko and Sheldon Whitehouse out of Rhode Island and others, to inject up to $10 billion in sequestration technology and soil health. That's really, really important. But also, again, to your point, I think one of the things is putting a carbon tax or a carbon pricing. It can be good, but can also work against us. So, for example, if you have a developing economy, a steel-producing facility, and you're putting a tax or a price there, well, that business, they might go out of business, and then that gets shifted to a developing economy, and that doesn't help them to scale and move forward. So you have to really look at this from a lot of angles, but you need all the players at the table, David, like you and your team and many others.
And we need you at the table as well in the Caribbean.
Together we can do some good things.
But I think even when you're talking to the general populace and so forth, again, climate resilient housing, I think the first panel you were on with me in January and February, we were talking about technologies that can make concrete with less water, which is one of the biggest offenders, right, when it comes to climate technology.
Yes.
But it also has resiliency against seawater. Right. This is your home. Everybody can understand that.
Literally, they can understand. You want to live here and be able to pass it on to a child, then you need to invest in this way. This is the kind of construction materials that you need to use. This is the regulations that we need to meet. These are the standards. So it's important that we do that, because ultimately, if your population does not have somewhere to live, it doesn't matter how much money they're making. They literally need to come home. First thing they need is to be able to have a place to live, and that's affordable. They need transportation to get to and from work. They need good education. They need good health. Like, you need those four things. But good health requires good food. You shouldn't have to import all of it. So for me, again, it is circular. And we need to understand the value of investing in all those different areas. It's not pick one, in my opinion. It's pick all.
Well, education, health, building wealth in a home, right? That takes away those generational wealth issues that we're talking about all the time.
It's crucial.
So we're going to leave this on a positive note. We're out of time. It goes by fast. Thanks for joining us on Trade Talks. I'm Jill Malandrino, Global Markets Reporter at Nasdaq.